In the dead of winter, 1892, something in Mexico City snapped. Behind the towering stone walls of a mansion on Tuba Street, children were screaming. Not ordinary screams, screams so raw, so gut-wrenching, they shattered the silence of the wealthiest neighborhood in the country. And no one knew why. But when the police broke down that door, what they found inside was straight from hell. We're talking an elite socialite with a twisted secret so dark, it changed Mexican history forever. Her name? Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano. Her legacy? Mexico's first female serial killer. And the truth about her has been buried for over a century. Until now. Welcome to the true story the government didn't want you to hear. This is not a ghost story. This is a real-life house of horrors that fooled an entire city and destroyed countless lives. Because while President Porfirio Diaz was parading Mexico City as a modern utopia, one woman turned her mansion into a child torture chamber. Elegant on the outside, evil on the inside. She wore silk gloves. She served tea to dignitaries. And behind closed doors, she experimented on orphans like they were lab rats. The screams weren't just rumors, they were real. Even hardened police officers said what they saw inside that mansion haunted their dreams forever. Tiny bones, blood-stained walls, and journals detailing every act of cruelty. She didn't kill out of rage. She killed out of curiosity. She documented pain like it was art. And speaking of art, famed Mexican illustrator José Guadalupe Posada saw the crime scene. He was so disturbed, he made etchings that still make people sick today. He called her La Temible, the terrifying one. But why did no one stop her? Because she was rich. Because she looked proper. Because no one believed a woman could do something this monstrous. And that's what made her unstoppable. This case is more than a horror story. It's a warning. About the evil that hides in plain sight. About what happens when society trusts appearances over truth. While gas lamps lit up polished avenues and carriages rolled past the starving, this woman was committing atrocities 5 minutes from Parliament. And guess what? Most people have never even heard her name. She almost got erased from history. But not today. If you think this story ends here, you're wrong. Because what the police uncovered next ties her crimes to an underground network of elite child traffickers. This wasn't just one woman. It was a system. And she was just the beginning. So if you've made it this far, don't scroll now. Because we're diving even deeper into what the authorities tried to hide for over a century. Subscribe if you're ready to help us dig up the truth. Like this video if your heart's pounding right now. And tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done if you heard screams from the house next door? This isn't just content. This is history's biggest cover-up. And we're not stopping until the world knows the full truth behind. La Temible. Unforgettable moment bonus. When they pulled up the floorboards, what they found made one officer collapse on the spot. It wasn't just bones. It was a diary. Written in a child's hand. Begging for someone, anyone, to come. This isn't just about monsters. It's about the children no one believed. It's about the silence that let evil win. And it's about breaking that silence, starting now. Mexico City was rotting from the inside. Crumbling tenements groaned under the weight of forgotten families. Children were rail-thin, starving, silent, and invisible. But just blocks away, a mansion on Tuba Street glistened like a palace. It belonged to Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano. A widow. A churchgoer. A trusted businesswoman. And secretly, a monster. At 43, she had outsmarted death itself, keeping her late husband's fortune intact with flawless poise and perfect manners. She walked through high society like royalty, sharp-boned, black-veiled, with eyes like steel. To the public, she was flawless. To the church, holy. To the desperate poor, a source of work. But to the girls behind her locked doors, she was a god of pain. Her mansion was no home. It was a machine. A pink limestone cathedral built for one purpose: torture disguised as training. She called it her special method. But it was something much darker, a psychological laboratory of suffering. In the servants' quarters, screams were muffled behind thick walls. No one ever saw what happened in there. No one dared ask. Because the girls she chose didn't matter to society. They came from villages. Poor. Illiterate. Alone. Sent to the capital by families hoping for honest work. But once inside her house, they vanished. And no one with power ever looked for them. Meanwhile, her son Aurelio, just 22, lived like a prisoner in the upper floor. He never invited friends. He never spoke above a whisper. His skin was ghost pale. His hands shook. He took laudanum just to sleep through the sounds that clawed through the floorboards at night. He had learned one thing as a child. When his mother's eyes began to shine, someone downstairs was about to suffer. Guadalupe's business was brilliant and terrifying. She provided young maids to Mexico's wealthiest families. But before they were sent away, she trained them. Break them. Mold them. And if they broke too easily, they disappeared. No records. No papers. No names anyone remembered. No questions asked. But for years, she was careful. She called it character building. No permanent scars. No visible trauma. Just humiliation, isolation, control. Until one day, she crossed the line. January 18, 1887. The day Mexico City woke up cold, gray, and shrouded in mist. A thin fog slithered over the ancient lakebed beneath the city. And inside the mansion, Guadalupe murdered her first victim. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't rage. It was a decision. And from that moment on, the woman high society adored became a predator with no leash. And no one stopped her. Because she wore black lace. Because she donated to charity. Because the world refused to believe a woman could be capable of such horror. But her victims? They knew. And now, so do we. If this story disturbed you, good. Because the silence that protected her for decades? Her mansion was beautiful. Her reputation untouchable. And under the floorboards were bones. The streets of Mexico City didn't feel real that morning. They shimmered in the mist, as if the city itself was holding its breath. It was January 18, 1887, and a 16-year-old orphan named Casimira Juarez was about to knock on the door of death. She had no idea. Casimira had traveled 6 days from the mountains of Michoacan. Alone. Hungry. Her parents had died in a cholera outbreak, and this was her last shot at survival. She carried everything she owned in a cloth bundle clutched to her chest. She had no family. No money. No way back. All she had was a letter. A recommendation from a village priest, praising the one woman known for saving girls like her. Señora Guadalupe Bejarano. When the mansion door creaked open, Guadalupe stood like a shadow, tall, sharp, dressed in black. She scanned the girl in one brutal second. Young. Alone. Vulnerable. Exactly what she hunted for. Casimira's dark braids were neat. Her patched dress was clean. And her eyes held that tragic blend of hope and fear. To Guadalupe, it was delicious. "I can see you've been raised properly," she said, folding the priest's letter. Her voice didn't invite trust. It commanded obedience. She led Casimira down marble-floored corridors past crucifixes and oil paintings, each one whispering false safety. The girl's new room was small but neat. A narrow bed. A wash basin. A crucifix staring down. "You'll find that I treat my servants fairly," Guadalupe told her. "But I expect absolute obedience." and silence. And Case Myra, desperate to belong, nodded. For the next 2 weeks, life in the mansion felt bearable. Almost kind. She rose before dawn. Cooked. Cleaned. Scrubbed fine silver until her fingers bled. And every time she passed her employer, she smiled, grateful just to be warm and fed. What she didn't see was the predator behind the politeness. Because while Case Myra thought she was learning a trade, she was being dissected. Every movement, every flinch, every response to pain. Guadalupe was studying her. Not like a boss. Like a scientist. How long before she cries? What makes her freeze up? How far can I go before she breaks? Case Myra was not a maid. She was a test subject. And she was passing, in all the worst ways. Case Myra had no idea she was living in a trap. No one outside would look for her. No one in the house would speak for her. And the woman she trusted was preparing her for something unspeakable. The door was carved by hand. The crucifix watched over her bed. The prayers echoed in the halls. But nothing in that house was holy. What happened next would shatter the illusion of safety and begin the darkest chapter of Guadalupe Bejarano's reign of terror. This was the calm before the slaughter. And Case Myra? She was about to disappear into history. If your skin crawled reading this, don't look away now. Case Myra had no idea she was being hunted. But Guadalupe did. Because for her twisted mission to succeed, she needed data, precise knowledge of when a person breaks. And Case Myra? She was the perfect experiment. It started with whispers. Invisible dust. Wrinkles in flawless linens. Meals made incorrectly, even when cooked to the letter. Case Myra apologized. Every time. She scrubbed harder. Worked faster. And unknowingly walked deeper into the trap. I'm beginning to think you're not as well trained as your priest claimed. Guadalupe hissed one night, her voice cold enough to make blood stop. Perhaps you need more intensive instruction. That was the moment it all changed. The punishments began. Hours standing still in the kitchen. Not allowed to move. Not allowed to speak. Eyes forward. Knees locked. No meals for stumbling from exhaustion. No water after scrubbing floors until her palms bled. And when her blood stained the stone, Guadalupe snapped. Look what a mess you've made. From the upper floor, her son Aurelio watched it unfold. And froze. He had seen this before. But never this far. Never this cruel. He tried to speak. To say something. To stop the inevitable. And what did his mother say? Perhaps you'd like to join Case Myra in her lessons about respect. Her stare froze him like winter stone. And just like that, he retreated into silence. Into laudanum. Into numbness. Because he knew exactly where this was headed. By February, Casimira's life was no longer a life. It was a sentence. Every day began with humiliation. Every night ended in pain. There were no more tasks. Only tortures dressed as lessons. And then Guadalupe took it even further. She descended into pure madness. The mansion's basement, once used for storage, had been transformed. Cold stone walls. No windows. No witnesses. She called it her training room. Here, Case Myra was stripped of clothing, warmth, and dignity. And made to stand, trembling, as Guadalupe circled her like a vulture. Look at yourself, she sneered. You see how ugly you've become. Casimira's bones jutted through skin. Her ribs like prison bars. Starvation sculpted her into a skeleton. And Guadalupe? She didn't just watch. She admired her own work. Because this wasn't about discipline anymore. This was a ritual. A sickness. A methodical descent into sadism. Case Myra was no longer a servant. Not even a prisoner. She was proof. Proof that Guadalupe could play God, and win. And above it all, in the upper room, Aurelio turned away. Increased the dose. Prayed for silence. But deep down, he knew. This time, no one was coming to save her. This is what happens when servants forget their place. She whispered it like a prayer. Like a lullaby. Like the words themselves would crawl under Casimira's skin. And then the iron hissed. The same brazier that once warmed Guadalupe's mansion now became an altar of pain. She heated iron tools until they glowed red like demon eyes. Then she hovered them close, just close enough for the terror to build. Casimira would scream before the metal even touched her. The heat. The anticipation. The agony of waiting. And then, contact. Brief. Precise. Controlled. Just enough to burn. Not enough to kill. Not yet. But Guadalupe wasn't just a torturer. She was a technician of trauma. After each session, she tended to the wounds. Applied healing salves. Whispered soft lies while bandaging the scars she created. Because the goal wasn't death. It was repetition. To destroy and rebuild. Again and again. She had studied anatomy like a doctor. She knew exactly how far she could go without ending it. She knew the limits of muscle, skin, and bone. But worse, she knew the limits of the mind. She forced Casimira to confess to crimes she never committed. To beg for punishment. To thank her abuser. To say, through cracked lips, that this pain was deserved. Day by day, the girl's reality collapsed. Her sense of self erased. She no longer knew what was real. Only that pain meant she existed. And Guadalupe was the one who gave her meaning. Above it all, Aurelio listened. Alone. Trapped. Terrified. The screams came through the walls like ghosts. No matter how much laudanum he drank, he couldn't escape them. So he wrote. His journal became the only place he could scream. February 15th. The screaming was worse last night. I covered my ears, but it comes through everything. Mother says it's for the girl's moral improvement, but her eyes, God, her eyes, I think she enjoys it. February 22nd. Blood on the stairs to the cellar. She says it was a cooking accident. What kind of recipe needs that much blood? February 28th. Haven't seen Casimira in days. Mother says she's too ill to work. But I hear things. Things I can't. I can't write what they sound like. His handwriting broke down into scratches. Like he was being pulled apart along with the girl below. And then, silence. March. 6 weeks of systematic torture had passed. The monster had pushed the body too far. Casimira's heart, frail, starved, beaten, just stopped. No warning. No ceremony. No final scream. Just the end. Guadalupe stared at the lifeless girl. And for a moment, felt nothing. Then. Something worse. Satisfaction. Because in her twisted mind, this was never murder. It was success. She learned, she thought. She finally learned. But what Guadalupe didn't know, what she couldn't control, was that a single crack had formed. And it was growing. Because someone saw. Someone heard. And someone was about to speak. She didn't mean to kill her. It was supposed to be another lesson. A routine correction. But Casimira was dead. And Guadalupe Bejarano stood over the body. Not in horror, but in awe. For a moment, she felt something close to joy. The process had been exquisite, a symphony of power, pain, and control. But now it was over. The canvas was blank. And the only question left was what to do with the remains. She moved with cold precision. She wrapped Casimira's limp body in old bedsheets, tied at the ankles and wrists like laundry. Then she waited. Until the deadest hours before dawn. When even the city's sins were asleep. She had already chosen a burial site. A forgotten patch of dirt beyond the edge of town. Where the earth was soft, the neighbors distant, and no one asked questions. She dug the grave herself. With gloved hands. In silence. No prayers. No guilt. Only a quiet thought. I can do this better next time. And that's when everything changed. At the bottom of that shallow grave, a new Guadalupe Bejarano was born. No longer experimenting. No longer doubting. She had tasted death, and wanted more. Not in rage. Not in haste. But with refinement. This wasn't madness. This was a system. Next time, I'll be smarter. Next time, no mistakes. Casimira was the prototype. And now, the predator was going professional. For the next year, Guadalupe became untouchable. By day, she was flawless. Hosting charity events for the cathedral. Expanding her domestic servant network. Whispering her way into Mexico City's most powerful families. She was respected. Adored. Saintly. But by night, she was designing the perfect kill. She studied people like blueprints. Who had no family. Who wouldn't be missed. Who could vanish without raising suspicion. She studied restraint, pain thresholds, anatomy. She made charts. Notes. Journals. Everything had to be more efficient. The tools got cleaner. The timing, tighter. The monster, smarter. But there was one loose end, Aurelio. Her son. Drifting further into madness. He wept uncontrollably. Talked to himself in riddles. Muttered about sins that bled through the walls. He wrote endless pages in his journal. Pages that sounded less like a diary, and more like a confession. Guadalupe knew it wouldn't take much for him to crack. So she found a solution. A German doctor. Specialist in nervous disorders. Discreet. Expensive. And most importantly, obedient. She told the city her son was suffering from melancholy. Privately, she just needed him silent. Because now, Guadalupe had a new mission. She wasn't just hiding a murder anymore. She was preparing. For the next one. If your heart dropped reading this, good. Because the most terrifying monsters aren't chaotic. They are organized. Respected. And still smiling at the Sunday sermon. By the time anyone noticed Elena Santos was missing, it was already too late. But this wasn't a disappearance. This was a design. A plan laid months in advance, and executed with surgical cruelty. It began in September 1888. Maria Santos arrived at the Bejarano mansion with desperation in her eyes and her 15-year-old daughter by her side. The drought had destroyed their farmland. Death had crushed what was left. Now, all they had was hope, and that, too, was running out. She's a hard worker, Maria said. She'll do anything. Just give her a chance. Guadalupe smiled. She already knew. Elena Santos was perfect. Young. Healthy. No family nearby. No one who'd come looking too hard. But most importantly, she wasn't broken yet. And Guadalupe loved nothing more than breaking strong girls. The first weeks felt normal. Elena worked hard. Polite. Quiet. Careful. But Guadalupe wasn't looking for mistakes. She was creating them. I notice you've been making more errors lately, she'd whisper. Perhaps the city doesn't suit girls like you. Every protest Elena made, every "I'm trying," was used against her. Effort is meaningless without results. Soon, everything became wrong. Cleaning wasn't clean enough. Food wasn't warm enough. Even her face was a problem. That look, what are you hiding behind those eyes? Guadalupe created a world where nothing Elena did was ever enough. Where the rules changed daily. Where the ground beneath her sanity began to shift. Then came the punishments. Not all at once. No, Guadalupe had learned her lesson. She spaced them out. Days, sometimes weeks, between each escalation. Just enough time for Elena to adapt. To forget. To accept. A missed spot during chores? Stand still for 6 hours. A lukewarm dish? No dinner. A glance that felt like defiance? Locked in the coal cellar, all night, with no light. No heat. And because it was gradual, Elena never saw the pattern. Not until her mind had frayed enough that resistance felt like disobedience. Or worse, betrayal. Meanwhile, upstairs, Aurelio watched. He saw what his mother was doing. He heard the whispers. The steps. The sobs behind closed doors. He started writing again. Frantic, broken entries in the margins of old books. She's doing it again. This one's stronger than the last. Why can't I stop her? But Aurelio couldn't stop her. Because who would believe him? The mad son. The trembling recluse. The boy whose testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of an invalid. Broken heart Elena never had a chance. Not in a house where survival depended on invisibility. And Guadalupe never let anyone stay invisible for long. Aurelio tried to stop her. Not once. Not twice. Several times. But every attempt was met with the same cold response. I see you're worried about Elena's training. That means you have a kind heart, but kindness without wisdom. That's what ruins people. And then came the threat. Veiled. Chilling. Inevitable. If you think you know better than me, then perhaps you'd like to take over her moral education yourself. Aurelio said nothing. But he understood. Disagreeing meant becoming the next victim. So he did what he always did. He retreated to his cold, silent room. And he wrote, in ink, in margins, in symbols no one would read. She's disappearing. The girl's eyes are empty. I can't save her. I can't save myself. By December 1888, Elena Santos wasn't Elena anymore. She was a shadow. A girl who no longer reacted to sunlight or smiles. She obeyed like a ghost, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't imagine not obeying. Guadalupe had perfected her cruelty. What happened to Case Myra was child's play. The basement was no longer a room. It was a machine. A carefully engineered chamber of controlled, sustained torment. Chains hung from beams. Iron links polished smooth, not by time, but by the trembling hands of the doomed. A brazier flickered in the corner, warming tools that gleamed black-blue from too many heatings. And at the center, the chair. Not just a chair. A weapon. Built by a local blacksmith, supposedly for invalid care. In truth, it was a restraint throne, designed to hold a human body perfectly still, while allowing access to every nerve. Every scream. Every inch of pain. Elena's final days lasted 3 nights. Each one planned like a twisted stage play. Guadalupe choreographed it like theater, but every scene was torture. Act 1, silence. Isolation. Cold floors. No light. Nothing but the sound of dripping and her own shallow breath. Act 2, screams. Chains. Heat. Metal. Flesh. Every pain followed by a whisper. See how much better you're becoming. Pain makes you pure. Act 3, hope. Food. A blanket. A smile. A hand on her shoulder, motherly, almost. But Elena had learned it by then. Kindness was just the start of something worse. She didn't know which was worse, the pain, or the fake peace between it. All she knew was that the world no longer had up or down. Only Guadalupe's voice. And upstairs? Aurelio sat frozen, writing faster than he could think. 3 nights. She's not crying anymore. The chain stopped moving. I think she's gone. She was. My dear, Guadalupe whispered, dabbing salve onto the burns she herself had inflicted hours earlier. This is all for your own good. Every soul must be purified before it can enter heaven. Some souls just need more cleansing than others. That was new. The religious angle. The sermons. The justification. Guadalupe wasn't just torturing anymore. She was saving. In her eyes, the screams were a hymn. The wounds were sacraments. The pain? Redemption. When Elena Santos finally died, her heart giving out in the middle of a session Guadalupe had choreographed for hours more. Guadalupe didn't cry. She didn't even look sad. She was furious. It was too soon. I wasn't finished. The performance she'd planned, meticulously, obsessively, had ended before the final act. Not a human tragedy, but an artistic failure. Still, she told herself, every failure is a lesson. The next girl would last longer. The pain would be cleaner. The results, more satisfying. She buried Elena like the others. But smarter this time. Multiple grave sites, scattered around the edge of the city. No patterns. No suspicion. She even varied the nights she went out digging. No one would see her. No one would connect the dots. 3 weeks later. A knock at the mansion door. Maria Santos. Frail. Pale. Eyes wide with dread. Where's my daughter? Why hasn't she written? Is she safe? Guadalupe didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this scene. Oh, Maria. I've been meaning to reach out. Elena fell very ill after Christmas. A fever, it affected her mind, I think. She became convinced your family was in danger and insisted on leaving immediately. I begged her to rest. But you know how stubborn girls can be. She was just so desperate to protect you. The story was airtight. Warm. Sad. Utterly false. But Maria believed it, because she needed to. Because it was easier than believing the silence meant death. And the way Guadalupe delivered it? Soft tone. Moist eyes. A gentle hand on Maria's shoulder. Perfectly convincing. Perfectly horrifying. Maria Santos left the mansion in tears. Clutching her shawl against the wind. Believing her daughter was somewhere out there. Struggling through Mexico's dangerous countryside. Never knowing that Elena's bones were already being picked clean in a shallow grave outside the city. From late 1888 to 1892, Guadalupe's methods became art. She didn't just kill. She refined. She perfected. She planned. She no longer acted on impulse. There were no fits of rage. No chaotic outbursts. Now, it was strategy. Control. Elegance. Guadalupe had learned that patience created better victims, and better stories to tell herself when it was done. In public, she transformed. The city no longer whispered about the cold widow with strange habits. Now they celebrated her. Relief efforts for earthquake victims? White heavy check mark. Funding orphanages? White heavy check mark. Donation so large the Archbishop praised her from the pulpit? White heavy check mark, white heavy check mark, white heavy check mark. She became a saint in the eyes of Mexico City. And saints don't commit murder. Saints don't torture girls in basements. So when someone did raise questions, the city scoffed. Madness. Blasphemy. Do you know how much she's done for the poor? Behind the scenes, her operation expanded. The domestic placement agency? It became a hunting ground. Vulnerable girls from across central Mexico. Hand-delivered to her mansion by desperate parents who thought they were giving their daughters a better life. They thought she was strict but safe. pious, generous, a Christian woman. But Guadalupe had designed a screening process more precise than any criminal profiler. Girls with no real family support. Girls with trauma. Girls with a spark in their eyes, that quiet strength she loved to crush. And of course, she wanted them beautiful. Not for lust. For aesthetic symmetry. The prettier the spirit, the more satisfying the ruin. And then there was Aurelio. The boy who once tried to resist was now no more than a ghost trapped in flesh. His nervous condition had worsened. Guadalupe made sure the doctors believed it was hereditary madness. Not trauma. Not horror. Not the things he'd seen. She kept him dosed on laudanum and opium. Aurelio wandered the halls like a sleepwalker. When he spoke, he rambled. When he wept, no one listened. "She's hurting them, please," the screams. The maids called it gibberish. The doctors called it delusion. And Guadalupe? She just smiled. Performing arts by 1892, Guadalupe had perfected the illusion. Fashionable alienists praised her for being a devoted mother, publicly applauding her efforts to save her son Aurelio. While behind closed doors, she made sure he stayed just unstable enough to never be believed. He would never be a threat again. Not to her secrets. Not to her legacy. But beneath the flawless surface, she was planning her most ambitious project yet. Case Myra and Elena? Those were rehearsals. They had satisfied her hunger, for a time. But now, she craved something deeper. A new experience. A masterwork of suffering. She wanted to break not one soul, but several. Together. The opportunity came like a gift wrapped in tragedy. That spring, a young woman named Esperanza Vega arrived in Mexico City with her two younger sisters, Carmen and Rosa. Their family had been destroyed, crops failed, violence erupted, and at just 19, Esperanza was all they had left. They were desperate. They needed work. And Guadalupe was waiting. She interviewed all three girls like she was examining rare art. Esperanza, tall, proud, and full of that fierce loyalty Guadalupe loved to watch unravel. Carmen, just 17, nervous, quiet, eyes darting like prey. Rosa, 15, too smart for her own good. A strategist. A potential threat. And Guadalupe smiled. "I can certainly use all three of you," she said with maternal warmth. "In fact, it would be ideal. Sisters support each other. They keep each other strong. They hold each other accountable." But what she didn't say was this. She had been waiting for a family. She had designed her new technique specifically for this. She wanted to use their love as a weapon. To turn sister against sister. To break them together, then break them apart. Because for Guadalupe Bejarano, destroying one soul at a time was no longer enough. Now she wanted to conduct a symphony of suffering. One where every scream harmonized. And every broken bond became her masterpiece. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of her depravity, the horror in Mexico City was only just beginning. Movie camera, her appetite for suffering had evolved. And now, she wasn't just inflicting pain. She was sculpting despair. The arrival of the Vega sisters marked the beginning of Guadalupe Bejarano's most sophisticated and prolonged campaign of torture. She no longer sought chaos. She sought artistry. And like any master, she had learned one lesson above all. Pain is more powerful when it arrives slowly. For the first month, nothing seemed wrong. The sisters were treated with warmth. Good food. Fair chores. Afternoons off to explore the city together. They laughed. They bonded. They believed they were safe. But it was all an illusion. A carefully engineered calm before the psychological storm. Then it began, subtly, precisely. Guadalupe started sowing division. She'd praise one sister, then criticize another, even if they'd done the same task. She'd offer small privileges, but make them compete for them. Rosa seems to be adjusting beautifully. She would whisper to Esperanza. Some girls are just naturally refined. And then to Carmen. Perhaps if you spent more time with me, you'd understand what Rosa already does. Each comment sounded harmless. But they were surgical strikes, designed to fracture their unity. By June 1892, Guadalupe had succeeded. The sisters still lived in the same room. But trust had evaporated. Each now carried private shame. Rosa wondering if she was too selfish. Carmen desperate to prove she was good enough. Esperanza plagued by guilt for bringing them here at all. That's when she unveiled the basement. It wasn't the same place Elena Santos had died in years before. Guadalupe had spent the interim upgrading it. Custom restraints, for perfect positioning. Medical instruments, designed for precise suffering. Walls lined with soundproof padding, to muffle screams. It was no longer just a room. It was a laboratory of human pain. The sisters were led there one by one. Not for punishment. But for private lessons. Just when they needed each other most. Guadalupe made sure they couldn't even trust their own memories. Who had betrayed who? Why was Rosa taken longer than the others? Why did Carmen cry all night, but refuse to say why? Why wouldn't Esperanza talk anymore? Guadalupe didn't just break bodies. She broke belief. She shattered what it meant to be sisters. And then watched how the pieces fell. This wasn't punishment. This was a performance. And every scream was applause. Movie camera, the training had begun. But this was no lesson in manners. This was a descent into a twisted ideology, where pain was discipline, and obedience was survival. The basement, once a crude cell, had become a chamber of engineered despair. There were now 3 restraint chairs, each perfectly positioned. So every girl could watch her sister's torment. This wasn't just about suffering. It was about shared agony. Weaponized love turned into collateral damage. Guadalupe welcomed them like a teacher introducing a new classroom. This is your special instruction room, she said gently, almost sweetly. Some lessons require more focus. They were strapped into the chairs. No pain, not yet. Just immobility. Just the slow, creeping realization that they had no control. The most important trait in a domestic servant, she began, pacing slowly in a circle, is obedience. Obedience requires understanding. Understanding requires experience. And experience, my dear girls, may be uncomfortable at first. She smiled. But it will make you better. Then, the demonstrations began. Nothing fatal. Nothing permanent. But everything unforgettable. Fire-heated rods pressed briefly to their skin, not to maim, but to teach. Water wave-controlled drownings, where water filled their lungs just long enough to trigger terror without death. High-voltage sine crude electrical pulses delivered by a rusted battery from a corrupt physician, shocking, precise, deliberate. And all the while, she narrated. See, Carmen? How your resistance only makes this harder for everyone. She'd whisper, pressing iron to the girl's shoulder. And Rosa, notice how your sister's selfishness causes pain, not just for her. She gestured toward Esperanza. But for you. This was her brilliance. Not the torture itself, but turning their love into the very tool that broke them. Each punishment became a performance. Every flinch, a lesson. Every scream, an example. Every moment of eye contact between sisters, a test of loyalty versus self-preservation. Movie camera, you're watching more than a crime. You're watching the methodical engineering of trauma. A woman who wasn't just evil. She believed her victims were better off because of her. Pain, Guadalupe would say, is not the enemy. Disobedience is. Movie camera, by winter of 1892, the Vega sisters were no longer sisters in any meaningful sense. They were inmates of a prison built not from bars, but from guilt, despair, and impossible choices. Guadalupe's methods had evolved into something monstrous. She no longer needed chains to bind them. She used each girl's love as the shackle. "Perhaps you'd like to encourage your sister to be more cooperative," she'd say softly to Carmen. After watching Rosa convulse under shock. "She's preventing me from moving on to more pleasant activities." The implication was clear. Obey, or someone you love suffers. Within weeks, the three girls became isolated islands. Once bonded by blood. Now fractured by fear. They would beg for favors, betray each other for the tiniest relief. A few minutes without the restraints. A slightly warmer meal. Anything to reduce the horror. Even if it meant increasing it for someone else. Movie camera. The most heartbreaking transformation was in Esperanza. The eldest sister, who had once promised to protect them all, was now crushed under the weight of that promise. "They are only here because of you," Guadalupe would remind her, almost sympathetically. "They suffer because you brought them here." And then came the final cruelty. "This can all stop, Esperanza. Just ask me to transfer their punishments to you." And of course, she did. Every time. Sobbing, shaking, she offered herself in their place. And just when she thought she'd finally saved them. "How selfish of you," Guadalupe would sigh. "Burdening your sisters with your pain. Don't you think they should share it?" There was no escape. No correct choice. Only new ways to break. But it wasn't just the Vega sisters who were crumbling. Movie camera. Guadalupe herself was unraveling. The intensity of managing three victims, day and night, combined with her obsessive perfectionism, was beginning to erode her once impeccable facade. She looked thinner. Hollow. Her eyes, wild with something between brilliance and madness. She stopped grooming herself. Stopped pretending to be normal. She began speaking aloud to imaginary colleagues at the dinner table. Conversations with unseen doctors. Questions about nerve response. Comments about optimizing agony. Even Aurelio, her drugged and damaged son, began to notice. And what he saw terrified him. "I think you're old enough now to understand," she told him one evening in December, sliding a glass of milk across the table. "Your education has been incomplete. Without exposure to the truth." Then she smiled. And invited him downstairs. Candle hash. What does a child see when his mother reveals the thing she's become? Can a mind already broken be shattered again? Skull. If you've made it this far, you're witnessing a transformation rarely caught in history. A predator pushed past her own limits. A family destroyed, not by violence alone, but by the twisted logic of love turned lethal. Movie camera. New Year's Day, 1893. The day Guadalupe Bejarano's carefully constructed world began to fracture. Not from rebellion. Not from escape. But from a routine church visit. Father Miguel Herrera, the parish priest, had come to deliver her annual charitable contribution receipt. A quiet tradition. A simple conversation about Lent. But this time, his visit aligned with one of Guadalupe's extended sessions. And the walls of the Bejarano estate, once thick with secrets, couldn't contain the screams. "Señora Bejarano?" Father Herrera asked gently, but with a priest's practiced suspicion. "Is someone ill in your household?" Those sounds suggest someone in considerable distress. Guadalupe, still flushed from exertion, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and smoke, appeared in the doorway moments later. Her hair hurriedly pinned. Hands trembling behind a handkerchief. But her mask, the one she'd worn for decades, was beginning to slip. She blamed the sounds on an ill-tempered maid. A stomach sickness. A reaction to spoiled goat's milk. "You know how dramatic these girls can be, Father," she smiled, too tightly. "But I'll be sure to send her to confession, if she survives the stew." But Father Herrera wasn't convinced. He left earlier than usual. And for the first time, he didn't bless the house on his way out. Movie camera upstairs, Aurelio had heard it all. The priest's voice. His mother's forced laughter. And beneath it, the muffled weeping of 3 broken girls below. He knew then. If he didn't act soon, he'd either become his mother's accomplice or her next victim. Spiral notebook # in the final days of December, Aurelio's secret journal had grown urgent. Detailed. Precise. Each entry an attempt to prove, to himself, that he wasn't imagining this. That his mother's evil was real. And that someone, someday, would believe him. December 15, 1892. Heard 3 distinct voices screaming from the basement last night. Mother says she's hired only 2 new servants, but I know what I heard. December 20, 1892. Found blood-stained clothing in her room while searching for laudanum. She said it was for medical instruction. But what kind of medicine leaves that much blood? December 28, 1892. She asked again for me to join her in the basement. Said I must begin taking on adult responsibilities, whether I want to or not. I think she means to make me participate. God help me, I think she will succeed. Each line was a confession. A last tether to his fading conscience. Aurelio had spent most of his life drugged, dulled, broken. But now he had clarity, and with it, terror. Movie camera the night after Father Herrera's visit, Guadalupe was restless. She paced the halls. Checked the locks. Peered through the curtains into the quiet streets of Mexico City. For the first time in her reign of terror, she felt exposed. And Aurelio, watching her from the shadows, made a decision. He would send the journal. He didn't know to whom yet, a priest, a constable, a journalist. But someone had to know what she had done. Before she dragged him downstairs. Movie camera documentary voiceover continued. As winter deepened into early 1893, the mask of Guadalupe Bejarano, once the darling of Mexico City's charitable elite, began to crack. Father Herrera's suspicions had only grown since that disturbing New Year's Day visit. Her excuse, a delirious maid with a fever, had satisfied him only temporarily. But it was her nervous demeanor, her hurried exit, her eyes, wild, unfocused, that haunted him long after he'd left her estate. So, he began asking questions. Quietly. Carefully. And what he found chilled him to the marrow. Open-door neighbors whispered of long, nightly screams, no longer the occasional scolding or raised voice, but full-throated, inhuman cries that stretched on for hours. The kind of screams that suggested someone wasn't being disciplined. They were being destroyed. Fire occasionally, the smell of burning flesh drifted from the mansion's ornate windows. No one said it out loud, not yet, but the implication hovered thick as smoke. Something isn't right in that house. Man #factory a blacksmith, asked to maintain discretion, came forward. He'd been commissioned by Senora Bejarano to build restraints. But these weren't for controlling servants. They were engineered, joints, clamps, screws, the kind of devices used not for management, but for torment. A local physician admitted he had provided Guadalupe with medical tools. Not just syringes or ointments, but bone saws, dilators, and narcotics strong enough to kill a horse. He thought she was performing underground procedures, perhaps abortions, perhaps surgery. But now he feared the truth was far worse. Shopping trolley, and most damning of all, several shopkeepers reported that her food orders had dropped significantly. Despite her claims of expanding her household staff, she was buying less. Fewer vegetables. Fewer loaves. Fewer meat cuts. So where were the servants? And more importantly, what were they being fed? Movie camera beneath the floors of that mansion, the Vega sisters remained trapped in a purgatory of pain. For over 6 months, Guadalupe had honed her techniques like a maestro perfecting a symphony. Each act crueler. More calculated. More artistic. Woman #girl and Esperanza, the once protective eldest, had fractured completely. Catatonic by day. Screaming by night. She'd become a shell, her identity reduced to a canvas of bruises, patterned burns, and deliberate lacerations. Each scar mapped with intentional cruelty. Some reopened again and again. Others left just long enough to scab, before being peeled back like paper. She's no longer a person, one witness would later say during the investigation. She was an object to Guadalupe. A project. Even more horrifying, medical examiners later confirmed internal injuries. Signs of violation so grotesque, they refused to describe them in full. Guadalupe Bejarano had passed the threshold of sadism into ritualized horror. And yet, she continued to smile at Mass. She hosted Sunday tea. She signed charitable checks with a pearl-handled pen. But in the shadows, her world was closing in. The night of February 14, 1893, marked the beginning of Guadalupe's unraveling. The rain had started that afternoon, soft at first, like a whisper against the stone balconies, but by dusk, it had become a constant percussion on the Bejarano estate's glass windows, like fingers tapping to be let in. Guadalupe barely noticed. Her attention was consumed by the meticulous preparations in the basement. The Vega sisters were gone, their remains buried in the rose garden under cover of night and silence. Rosa had died last, slowly, and with eyes wide open. Guadalupe had watched her final breath with something close to reverence. But she did not mourn. Mourning was for women with souls. Now, she was ready for something new. Upstairs, Isabella Mendez was asleep. She lay curled on a stiff mattress in a guest room with no curtains and a single oil lamp, her mother beside her, drained from days of travel and false kindness. Guadalupe had woven her web with calculated precision, gifts of warm soup, gentle inquiries about their past, and the promise of steady work. Julia Mendez, worn down by poverty and desperation, had accepted the offer like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. Guadalupe had already chosen the room that would become Isabella's cell. But she hadn't accounted for Aurelio. For months, he had wandered the corridors like a phantom, unnoticed and unchallenged. His opium-stained dreams had dulled him for years, and Guadalupe had stopped expecting anything from him long ago. What she didn't see was that the apathy had fractured. Her son had watched the Vega sisters waste away. He had heard Rosa's voice pleading behind locked doors. And he had written, night after night, hunched over a ledger in his room, recording the unspeakable with painstaking detail. Now, the journal was full. And Aurelio had run out of excuses. That evening, he had left the house under the pretense of seeking laudanum from a local apothecary. Instead, he had gone to the rectory. Father Herrera opened the door to find the boy soaked to the bone, shaking and pale, but holding the leather-bound volume in both hands like an offering. He did not speak. He didn't have to. What the priest read in those pages chilled him more deeply than the storm outside. There were names, descriptions, drawings, even dates. He recognized some of the victims from parish rosters, girls who had vanished under the guise of employment. Servants no one had followed up on. Father Herrera realized, with growing horror, that this wasn't a house of cruelty. It was a system. A cycle. A theology of pain with Guadalupe as its deity. He summoned the Guardia Civil before dawn. At the Bejarano mansion, Guadalupe was laying out her instruments. Polished metal gleamed beneath the lantern light, tools that no midwife or doctor would claim, forged for one purpose only, to destroy. She hummed as she worked, a lullaby that Carmen used to sing before madness swallowed her voice. Guadalupe didn't notice the shift in the air until it was too late, the sudden stillness, the absence of creaking floorboards, the unnatural quiet. She turned toward the doorway just as Aurelio stepped into the room. He was dry now, dressed neatly, his hands behind his back. His eyes, so long dulled by drugs and dread, now glinted with something she had never seen in him before. Resolve. "What have you done?" she asked, more out of habit than concern. Aurelio didn't answer. Then came the sound, distant but clear, the heavy knock of fists against the front doors. Not once. Not twice. Repeated, forceful, authoritative. It echoed through the halls like a death toll. She froze. Another knock. Then voices. Then the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. Aurelio stepped aside. And into the room came Father Herrera, flanked by 2 armed officers and a 4th man carrying a canvas bag, the kind used to collect evidence. Guadalupe said nothing at first. Her fingers twitched, as if still searching for a scalpel. "You cannot know what you are doing," she whispered, her voice dry and venomous. "We know enough," Father Herrera said, his voice low. "And God knows the rest." The officers moved forward. She didn't fight. Not then. Not when they took her arms, not even when they snapped manacles around her wrists. But her eyes never left her son. "You are no son of mine," she hissed. "No," Aurelio replied. "I never was." The trial was held in secrecy, far from the public eye. Even among the justices of Mexico City, the true scope of her crimes was difficult to process. Witnesses came forward, neighbors who had heard screams, tradesmen who had delivered tools they could no longer deny, physicians whose discretion had been purchased with guilt. But it was Aurelio's journal, cataloguing 6 years of darkness, that sealed her fate. She was sentenced to die by hanging. But Guadalupe never reached the gallows. On the eve of her execution, she was found in her cell, dead from a self-inflicted wound. No blade was discovered, only a shard of bone snapped from her own hand and used to carve a hole beneath her ribs. Some said she died grinning. Others said her last words were a song. In the years that followed, the Bejarano estate was abandoned. No one dared claim it, and no family remained to keep it warm. The roses in the garden grew wild, untamed, blooming blood-red even in the winter. And late at night, if you listened closely, some claimed you could still hear a voice, soft and sickly sweet, singing a lullaby through the floorboards. The same lullaby Carmen had once sung, when she was still sane. On the night of February 14, 1893, a mansion in Mexico City turned into hell. 3 sisters. 1 sadistic killer. And a son with a secret so dangerous, it could get him killed. This is the final chapter of Mexico's most successful serial killer, Guadalupe Bejarano, a woman so terrifying, she turned torture into an art form, and used her own mansion as a slaughterhouse. But she had no idea, her own son was about to betray her. Guadalupe had planned one last, perfect, torture session, the grand finale with the Vega sisters, 3 young women who had already endured months of sadistic torment. She wanted to finish them off. Then, she'd move on to her next victim, a 14-year-old girl named Isabella. But what Guadalupe didn't know was that her son Aurelio had reached a breaking point. Driven by fear, fueled by opium, and backed into a corner, he made the most dangerous decision of his life. For weeks, Aurelio had been secretly meeting with a priest, Father Herrera, slipping him exact journals, sketches of the basement dungeon, lists of victims, even maps to burial sites outside the city. He documented everything. Dates, names, medical tools, chemical compounds, even the way she laughed while breaking bones. This wasn't a mother gone mad. This was a monster with a method. But exposing her wouldn't be easy. Guadalupe was one of the city's most respected women. Charitable, powerful, untouchable. If they failed, she wouldn't just ruin Aurelio, she'd destroy everyone involved. So they made a plan. Aurelio would let the authorities in during the torture. Live evidence. Caught in the act. No escape. That night, Guadalupe lit candles, prepared her tools, and walked into the basement for what she thought would be her final masterpiece. Meanwhile, Aurelio unlocked the rear gate. A small squad of investigators, led by Father Herrera, slipped inside. He led them through the creaking corridors, down the pitch-black stairs, to a hidden door behind the wine cellar. What they saw next would scar them for life. The door opened to a room no human should ever witness. The Vega sisters were strapped to iron chairs, their bodies mutilated, burned, dissected, yet somehow, still alive. The air reeked of blood and chemicals. The walls were covered in diagrams, restraints, photos. Jars filled with preserved flesh lined the shelves. One officer vomited. Another tried to strangle Guadalupe on sight. They had to be physically restrained. Because in that moment, everyone realized. This wasn't just murder. This was a system. And Guadalupe had perfected it. But now, it was over. They arrested her on the spot. The Vega sisters were rushed to emergency care, barely breathing. The story exploded across Mexico. And Aurelio? His bravery saved lives, but it came at a cost. He disappeared from public record, likely hidden by the church to protect him from backlash. Guadalupe Bejarano's mansion was later destroyed. No memorial. No grave. No statue. Just a buried legacy of horror. But her story still haunts historians, true crime fans, and anyone who dares ask. How many monsters hide behind a smile? And how close are we to them every day? The basement wasn't just a torture chamber. It was a cathedral of cruelty. And at its center stood Guadalupe Bejarano. Calm, composed, and completely detached from reality. As officers stormed the room, weapons drawn, jaws locked in horror. She didn't even blink. Wearing ceremonial black robes like a twisted high priestess. She turned to face them with bloodied instruments still in hand, and said, "Gentlemen, I assume you have proper authorization for this intrusion into my private household affairs." What? This wasn't shock. This wasn't fear. This was delusion at its peak. A woman so far gone, she thought her torture sessions were moral instruction. She called the victims her students. She called the mutilation intensive guidance. And she believed, truly believed, she was saving their souls. But the truth told a much darker story. Investigators began combing through the chamber. And what they uncovered made every word of Aurelio's testimony seem tame in comparison. They found manuals. Notebooks filled with diagrams of human nerves, journals color-coded by the types of screams victims made. Entries like October 15, 1892. The eldest sister's resistance continues. Her threshold for pain is extraordinary. This wasn't random violence. This was science. Twisted, organized, ritualized torture. Every victim categorized. Every experiment recorded. They found medical instruments custom modified to inflict maximum agony. Restraints engineered to hold bodies in exact positions. And a secret drawer filled with trophies, necklaces, buttons, scraps of clothing, each tagged with a name. Human souvenirs. The Vega sisters' condition? Unimaginable. Esperanza was unconscious, barely breathing, her pulse so weak that doctors later said it was a miracle she survived. Carmen was conscious, but vacant. Staring at nothing. Silent tears spilling down her face. Rosa, broken but still lucid, whispered only one thing to her rescuers. "Please, kill me." These weren't just victims. They were survivors of hell on earth. But even hell has a reckoning. Guadalupe was arrested that night. Her mask of control finally cracked when her journals were read aloud in court, page after page of deliberate, remorseless cruelty. She wasn't insane. She was methodical. Cold. Proud. Her defense collapsed instantly. And Aurelio? Though shattered by guilt, he disappeared into protective exile. Some say he became a monk. Others say he died anonymously in another city. But his bravery saved countless lives. The mansion? Burned. Its ruins buried beneath a city that tried to forget. But no one ever really forgot. Because the question still echoes through the alleys of Mexico City. How do you stop a monster who believes they are doing good? And more terrifying, how many more are out there, hiding behind power, wealth, and a smile? The arrest of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano on February 15, 1893 didn't just shock Mexico. It fractured the nation's soul. For decades, She had been praised as a beacon of morality, a generous patron of orphanages, a woman applauded by archbishops and presidents alike. Now she stood accused of monstrous crime so incomprehensible, the public couldn't believe it. How could someone who donated thousands of pesos to churches also keep young girls chained beneath her mansion? How could a woman so respected be a serial killer? The evidence was overwhelming. Inside her basement, authorities found surgical instruments retrofitted for maximum pain, handcrafted restraints designed for strategic torment, and journals, pages and pages of clinical madness. Pain shared among family members seems to multiply exponentially. October 22, 1892. The middle sister's psychological withdrawal can be temporarily reversed through specific threat application to her siblings. November 3, 1892. Their deterioration has reached the point of diminishing returns. New acquisitions will be necessary. December 12, 1892. These weren't the ravings of an unstable mind. They were methodical, measured, controlled. Guadalupe didn't lose her mind. She chose this. The courtroom was packed to suffocation. Journalists, priests, senators, social reformers, angry mothers, trembling nuns, all there to see the woman whose hands had signed charity checks and carved living girls apart. And she did not flinch. No remorse. No apologies. No understanding of her crimes. When asked why she tortured the Vega sisters, she replied, as though teaching Sunday school. These girls came to me as ignorant country peasants. I offered them spiritual purification. The pain they endured was unfortunate, but necessary. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Some wept. Others shouted. Guadalupe simply smiled, as if pitying the audience for not understanding her genius. The prosecution laid out the case like an autopsy. The murders of Casimiro Juarez and Elena Santos, confirmed through burial sites matched to journal entries. The surviving Vega sisters, whose battered bodies required months of hospitalization. Medical analysis proving Guadalupe had deliberately prolonged pain to avoid death, a slow, scientific dismantling of the human body and mind. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the church itself. Multiple officials admitted they had received whispers, complaints, letters, but ignored them. Guadalupe was too powerful, too respected. To question her was to risk career suicide. It wasn't a lack of knowledge that let the horror grow. It was cowardice. Outside the courtroom, public rage exploded. José Guadalupe Posada, Mexico's most famous illustrator, saw in her case something deeper than a scandal. He began sketching Guadalupe not as a woman, but as death herself, robed in lace, eyes hollow, a rosary of severed fingers clutched between skeletal hands. His drawings spread like wildfire. The respectable widow became a folk monster, a living Santa Muerte. Guadalupe Bejarano was found guilty on all counts. She never wept, never protested. When the sentence of death was passed, she simply nodded and asked, "Will there be time for confession?" No one answered her. She died by firing squad on June 9, 1893, reportedly whispering prayers as the bullet struck her chest. She wore black. As for the Vega sisters, Esperanza never spoke again. Carmen lived in a sanitarium until her death in 1910. Rosa went on to testify against child abusers in court, until the trauma finally consumed her. Their survival was a miracle. But what they endured, no miracle could erase. Today, few remember Guadalupe Bejarano by name. But legends still swirl around the ruins of her estate. Locals say if you walk near the foundations at midnight, you'll hear soft weeping. And a woman's voice, calm and cold, whispering, "This is for your purification." Because some monsters aren't born in shadows. They rise in daylight. They wear pearls. And they call their evil charity. Never ignore the warning signs. Not every predator wears fangs. Some wear crosses. The courtroom had fallen silent. After months of testimony, scandal, and soul-wrenching revelations, the verdict was in. Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano was found guilty. But not of everything. Only 2 counts of murder in the first degree. Only multiple counts of torture and assault. And when the sentence was read aloud, 10 years and 8 months in prison. The silence turned to rage. The public was furious. How could a woman responsible for decades of abuse, a private dungeon of human suffering, and the death of innocents, be given a punishment lighter than some thieves? The answer lay buried beneath centuries of gender bias and legal inexperience. Mexico had never tried a woman for serial murder before. The justice system had no map for this terrain, and it showed. Even Aurelio, her trembling, shell-shocked son who had cooperated with the investigation, wasn't spared. Despite evidence of lifelong psychological abuse, despite his testimony, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for complicity. The court acknowledged his fear, but said fear alone wasn't enough. He had watched people die, and stayed silent. But the most haunting part of the aftermath wasn't in court. It was what José Guadalupe Posada left behind. The famed illustrator turned the Bejarano horrors into a visual mythology. A gallery of nightmares that Mexico couldn't look away from. One engraving in particular burned into the national memory. Guadalupe stands, perfectly dressed in black velvet. Her hair is immaculate. Her smile faint. Behind her, the Vega sisters suffer, skin peeled, eyes empty. Around her, racks, hooks, branding tools, a stained altar. But her expression is calm. Elegant. Unbothered. It wasn't just a portrait. It was a warning. Evil doesn't always come with a scream. Sometimes it comes with a smile, a rosary, and perfect posture. Posada's work spread beyond newspapers. His engravings were passed around in markets, tacked to chapel doors, even sold by candlelight in alleyways. The public turned her into folklore, not to forget her, but to never forget. She became a symbol of the mask evil wears. And what of the Vega sisters? Esperanza never saw justice. She died weeks after being rescued, her body too broken to heal. Carmen and Rosa were committed to institutions, where they would live out their remaining days in silence, rarely speaking, often screaming in the night. They didn't just lose their childhood. They lost their chance at ever being whole again. Guadalupe was sent to Cárcel de Belén, one of the most feared prisons in the country. Even there, her reputation arrived before she did. Inmates whispered her name like a curse. Guards stared with curiosity and disgust. Some worshipped her. Others plotted against her. Over time, she became isolated, avoided even by murderers and thieves. There were rumors that she performed strange rituals in her cell, that she spoke to shadows, that she was writing new journals. But no one ever saw them. In 1902, just 9 years into her sentence, she died suddenly. Official cause, unknown illness. No family claimed the body. She was buried in an unmarked grave behind the prison chapel. Some say she cursed the earth around it. Nothing ever grows there. Legacy. What remains? A broken family. A nation forced to confront its darkest instincts. And a single message, passed down through generations. Monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes, they host charity dinners. In the end, even hell wouldn't take her. Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano entered prison with her head high. Still believing she was right, still claiming she had done God's work. But inside Cárcel de Belén, no one cared who she had been. And everyone knew what she had done. Murderers. Thieves. Arsonists. Prostitutes. Even the worst of them had limits. And child torture? That was the uncrossable line. Guadalupe crossed it, and she paid. Within days, she was forced into permanent solitary confinement, not for punishment, but for protection. If she stepped outside for even a moment, inmates would scream, spit, and throw objects at her. The guards did nothing. Many had daughters of their own. Inside her cell, just 7 feet of stone and shadow, Guadalupe began to rot. But not just physically. She started writing again. Dozens of new journals. rambling theories about human nature, punishment, sin, and salvation. She called her ideas moral recalibration. But this time, there were no readers. No students. No victims. No applause. Her words echoed off the walls, and died in the silence she couldn't stand. The transformation was brutal. Her once flawless black gowns were replaced by coarse, lice-ridden uniforms. Her perfectly combed hair turned to a grey, tangled mat. Her voice, once commanding rooms of intellectuals, became a hoarse whisper, barely heard through the iron bars. No one feared her now. No one listened. She begged guards for longer walks, for soap, for someone to talk to. All she got was more silence. The irony was cruel. The same isolation that once empowered her, the secrecy, the privacy, the control, became her slow, suffocating punishment. She had always needed control over someone. Now she had no one. Nothing to manipulate. No one to impress. No audience. No legacy. Only the scratching of her own pen, and the creeping chill of a prison winter. In December 1895, just 2 years into her sentence, guards found her slumped in the corner of her cell. Her hands were stiff. Her lips blue. Dead. The official report listed pneumonia as the cause. But those closest to her whispered the truth. She didn't die from illness. She died from being forgotten. Her body was unclaimed. No funeral. No visitors. No legacy. Just a shallow grave outside the prison wall, marked by no stone. Prison folklore says nothing ever grows there, not even weeds. But her story did not vanish. The journals she wrote in prison were never published. Some say they were burned. Others claim they still exist in a government vault, too dangerous to release. But what remained was more powerful than any diary. The engraved images by Posada. The nightmares of those who survived. And the chilling truth that evil can look respectable, and justice doesn't always look like revenge. Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano died alone. But the world never forgot her. She was a mother. A socialite. A scholar. And a monster. And in her fall, in her suffocating, silent end, the world learned something terrifying. Even monsters can wear pearls. But in the end, monsters always starve when no one is left to fear them. She died like she lived, surrounded by silence, but never peace. Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano was found slumped on the cold floor of her cell, her body marked by bruises and injuries too specific to be called accidental. The guards didn't ask questions. No reports were filed. No charges laid. No one cared. Even in death, she was shown no more dignity than she had ever shown her victims. A priest read her final rites like a man checking boxes. Not from mercy, but obligation. No family came forward. No tears were shed. No coffin. No headstone. Just a name crossed out in prison logs, and a soul dropped into the dirt. But the echoes of what she did didn't die with her. The trial of Guadalupe had cracked open something too big to be buried. Her victims were poor girls, forgotten girls, the kind who vanished and were blamed for running away. But her story forced Mexico to see the truth. That monsters weren't just lurking in alleys. Sometimes they hosted charity dinners. What followed was a reckoning. Police departments were overhauled. Missing persons reports became mandatory, no matter who filed them. Doctors and therapists were watched more closely. And for the first time in Mexican legal history, serial murder was named, studied, and punished. Because what Guadalupe had done was no longer unimaginable. But the deeper horror came from what the investigation revealed. So many had known. Doctors. Priests. Neighbors. Even the elite of Mexico City, her so-called friends, had suspected, whispered, and looked the other way. Not out of fear, but because it was easier to stay silent. The true crime wasn't just what Guadalupe did in her basement. It was what an entire society allowed her to do, because she dressed well, spoke gently, and made generous donations. Decades later, the house was sold. Renovated. Almost forgotten. Until workers dug into the basement and found it. The room. The stone walls still stained. The floor still etched with rusted rings and chain bolts. One man claimed the air was so thick, it choked him. Another said he heard weeping when he touched the walls. The entire crew quit the job that same week. The house was demolished the following year. But even now, locals claim that on some nights, when the wind dies and the street goes still, you can still hear the screams. The story of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano didn't end with her death. It became legend. It became warning. A reminder that evil doesn't always show its teeth. Sometimes, it wears a smile, sips tea, hands out charity, and asks to be trusted. Because the worst monsters aren't the ones hiding in shadows. They are the ones standing in the light, wearing pearls. So ask yourself, did we ever know the full story? Or did she take her worst secrets to the grave? What else lay buried in that basement? And how many more walk among us today, unnoticed, respected, and utterly untouchable? If this tale disturbed you, it should. Because the real horror isn't what happened. It's how easily it could happen again. White right pointing backhand index. Comment your thoughts below. Skull. What would justice have looked like for her victims? How do we spot predators in plain sight? And if you're ready for another story the world tried to forget, subscribe, share, and join us next time on Sanctified Sin. Because history doesn't hide its monsters. It protects them until someone digs up the truth.